Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Richard Metal Fan Interviews. This is episode number 155. And today's guest, we're talking to my buddy Lee Harrison. He is the drummer for the band Monstrosity, a death metal band based out of Florida. Today we're going to be talking to him about what got him into metal, what made him want to start playing drums, as well as doing a rundown of his discography. So without further ado, let's go talk to Lee. So what's up, guys? I am here with my man Lee Harrison from Monstrosity. So how are you doing today, Lee?
Doing all right, man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
stay
So
busy.
it's great to be able to talk with you today. So kind of like the format is, I want to do like a rundown of your discography and do talk about like your musical journey from where you started to now. But before we go into that, take me back to young Lee Harrison. So kind of growing up, what were the first bands that got you into metal? What made you want to start playing drums?
All right. Well, I grew up in Miami, and there was some music before, but I would say directly it would be Kiss in 1977. Uh, Pretty much possessed my soul. And then, I started with Spoons on magazines, and then I think my dad got me an acoustic guitar. It wasn't in the best shape, but it was decent enough. And I fooled around with that a little bit. And then let's see, it's kind of a long story, but I've told it a bunch, so you might have heard it somewhere else. But basically, I'm left-handed, and I was trying to play the guitar left-handed, and my dad wouldn't let me. So I kind of got discouraged with the guitar a little bit.
Wow.
Um, but I'm glad he did it because eventually I did learn to play right-handed, and it's just such an easier thing playing right-handed guitar because everybody else plays right-handed guitar. And I'm glad he did it ultimately, but at first it was a little discouraging, and that's kind of how I fell into the drums because it's kind of something else. He realized that, and um, my dad had a friend that owned an apartment complex in South Miami, and one of his tenants was the jazz drummer at the University of Miami, and he gave private lessons out of his apartment too. So my dad and him discussed, and basically I started taking lessons with that guy. His name's Steve Rucker. Um, Years later, he ended up becoming Bee Gees drummer, and he's just a killer drummer. He's still in Miami. Still, he's I'm pretty sure he's at the University of Miami still, doing stuff there. I don't know exactly how it works, but he's still around. Anyway, from there around, like I said, Kiss was my main thing. When I was that young, seeing the stage show and the fire and the blood and the plus the music was heavy. It just resonated with 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old me. And I had neighborhood friends who were, had kind of we were all in the same kind of thing. We had a little neighborhood band called Ozone was the name of our band, and I actually have a video of us playing in fifth grade uh, in the classroom. Like on the chalkboard, we have like a big Ozone logo behind us,
Wow.
and yeah, so we weren't that good, and it was real basic rock, But this was pretty early on. From there, my parents moved to the west coast of Florida, which is basically south of Sarasota, and so I went to high school there, and there was just no one really into metal music or rock music or anything, and there weren't a lot of musicians, if any. There were a few, but no one was really taking it serious. When I was 13, I had a band called Black Rose, and I was 13. The guys I was jamming with were like 16 and 17, so they were a little older. They were into drinking and getting high and stuff, so they weren't taking it as serious, but they were pretty good. They could play. So I worked with them for a little bit. and just to play. And then they kind of drifted off. I don't even know what happened to them, but uh, I kind of played on my own. I ended up getting a guitar and an amp and would make demos by myself, and just pretty much went to school those years. And then around 16, I got a job at a game room. I started off slinging popcorn, and then I eventually got moved up into the game room, and I was the game room manager, making 375 an hour. And I saved up for my drum kit that I used for the early, pretty much most of the '90s. Um, it wasn't the best kit for sure, but it
Do you
it was a
remember
real
which one
kit.
is it?
Yeah, it's a Tama swing. I don't know, swing star. Yeah, it was, like I said, it was kind of like the lower level Tama, but it was something I could afford for 375 an hour. And through a lot of those years in the '90s, I already got a drum set. I need cymbals or I need stuff. You know what I mean? So I never really upgraded. And back then we weren't so worried about like endorsements and things. That was, we were underground metal. Most those kind of companies weren't taking us seriously.
Yeah.
In fact, later on when I went to Tama, they kind of, I told them my story thinking they'd be like, wow, the kid worked 335, 375 an hour. I wasn't looking for a free drum set, but I was looking, for some kind of, uh, sympathy. And they just didn't. They kind of blew me off, and it kind of discouraged me. So I never went with Tama because of that. And I, really wasn't. That was kind of the end of that. But anyway, back to my story. So then, like I said, I was on the west coast of Florida throughout my teenage years, going to high school and stuff. And then I still had friends in Miami, those childhood friends that I had grown up with or whatever, I still talked to. And I would go to Miami from time to time. Uh, and one friend in particular, my buddy Robbie, he had, he would, in Miami compared to where I was, like the trends would hit sooner, like they would get all the cool records before, and then it would take time, and then finally they would, people in like where I was on the West Coast would, get kind of caught up to what was going on. So when I would go to Miami, I would, I'd get exposed to, whatever the latest stuff going on is, and I remember in Merciful Fate and those kind of bands, getting exposed to them and then bringing them back to where I was on the West Coast and like exposing people over there to it, just
Nice.
because it was so underground, and so going back and forth to Miami, I he had uh, he had become friends with this singer guy named Bobby, and Bobby had a guitar player, and they were all friends with the band Cynic. And back then, Cynic was a thrash band. They weren't the jazz band that and that everybody knows today. They were like a serious thrash band, and like
Yeah.
trying to be underground heavy, not quite death metal, but definitely like it was kind of before death metal really became the full thing in Florida,
Yeah.
and so and those guys could play and they were serious and they practiced every day, and it was like they were like taking it as serious as I wanted to take it. And so I went down there and I met with them through my childhood friend Robbie that I was telling you about. And I met Mark Van Erp, the bass player who was playing with Cynic at the time, and he ended up becoming the Monstrosity. Me and him put together Monstrosity years later. But at the time, we were just friends, and of course, I met Paul and Sean from Cynic, and I eventually met Jason. Jason, I don't even think was in Cynic when I first met him. They had a different singer named Jack Kelly, who was just kind of a friend of theirs that was hanging out. And they didn't have anybody to sing, so they threw him on the vocals. That's kind of how he became the singer for Cynic. And they were doing shows at the Cameo Theater on Miami Beach, and that was kind of like a big theater type place. And it was like, wow, they got a real venue and they're playing shows and they're taking it seriously, so pretty much once I turned 18, I packed up my drums and I had a red and white van, and I moved to Miami and tried to form something with that singer guy, Bobby. and thinking that, if nothing else, that something else will fall in my lap, and something can happen. So I did that. I moved in with Bobby and his parents, and I stayed there for about a month. And, living with his parents, it was kind of tough. And a lot of times we would just pack up the van and go down to Miami Beach. And, I would help Cynic pass out flyers for their shows. And it was kind of like I wasn't doing anything yet. I was kind of like more in the wings, like roading, not roading, but, helping them out. I would take, we'd go to shows, and they could, we would use my van to like load Sean's drums, and we would all pile in my van and, go play wherever they were playing. Um, and I was just hanging around them, trying to help them, like, um, giving them suggestions and my feedback and ideas. And me and Van Erp, we ended up, Van Erp had an apartment, and I ended up living there for a while. And then eventually I ended up in this kind of hardcore band. It was kind of on the at the end of their tenure as a band. They were a little older, and they kind of were getting burnt out on it, but they were still going, and they were good guys, and they had good, decent music. And I ended up joining that band, and they had a warehouse in the Kendall area, which South Miami, basically.
Yeah.
And so Cynic ended up moving in there with them. So like we had a huge warehouse with like my drums in one corner and Sean Reinert's drums in the other corner. And then we had like all of our amps on the back wall. And then there was like a little business office downstairs, and upstairs there was like a little room. And so we had a little bedroom up there where uh, we lived, basically.
Yeah.
And so me and Mark Van Erp, we would just, hang out. It was cheap because we had so many people paying on it. It was like $50 a month, and we got, that's how much it cost us to live. So we really didn't work. We just would jam all day, or worry about, band stuff, and you know both bands were practicing there, and so we were just doing that. And eventually, Malevolent Creation moved down from Buffalo to Fort Lauderdale, and after a while, they became like they were like the new band on the scene. And so I remember Cynic played with Malevolent Creation, and they were kind of more of a Slayer thing back then, like, definitely hardcore influenced by Slayer. And they had a drummer, and they weren't really happy with him. He couldn't play double bass as fast as Phil wanted. They weren't that good at it. So we got to talking, and I ended up, long story longer, I ended up dipping out and leaving Miami, leaving that warehouse situation, and moved to Fort Lauderdale and joined Malevolent Creation.
Yeah.
And so then that would have been February of 1989.
Yeah. I think it did like the first like demo or something.
Yeah, well, let me get there. So we came up, and like within 3 weeks, we were playing shows. I learned the set, and same kind of thing. I stayed at this guy's Bill's house for like a few weeks or whatever, but then eventually I ended up moving into the warehouse, and it was just cheaper to live, and plus I could just jam all the time, because that's what I was interested in. I just wanted to jam full time. And I mean, at one point in Miami, it got to where I would, I didn't have a place to set up my drums, so I would set them up in the back of my van and just practice in a mall parking lot in the back of my van, just because I was so hungry to practice and jam. But anyway, back to Lauderdale. So we ended up doing we started playing shows within 3 weeks, and we started to take off at this place called the Tree House. And one thing about Malevolent is that they were from Buffalo, and Phil had like all these cousins and brothers, and kind of friends of theirs that had moved down from Buffalo with him. So we kind of had a built-in crowd. So when we play the Treehouse, there'd be like 30 people there with us, and so like the club owners were kind of impressed with that they didn't realize they were family and friends. They just thought that we had a following, and so they would book us a lot. And so we were playing Treehouse pretty much every 2 weeks. That was kind of our thing. And we did the 89 demo that you were talking about. And right around that time, we started getting into the underground tape trading thing and sending out cassette tapes, basically that demo everywhere, that we could find. Pat from Hellwitch helped us out with a lot of addresses and, turning us on to fanzines that were going. And from there, it kind of snowballed and we just kept pushing and pushing. So, like I said, I came down to Fort Lauderdale in February of '89. In June of '89, I remember still living at the warehouse, and Phil came to the warehouse one day, and he had the obituary, Slowly We Rot, and he had Sepultura, Beneath the Remains. Both albums had come out on the same day, and
Wow.
he had picked them up, and that was kind of we had heard Death, and we were fans of Death, and we knew, we were friends with Chuck or whatever, and we had actually tried to bring Chuck down to jam, to play a show with Cynic, but something happened and it didn't happen. Happened later on, but anyway. So we knew of Death, and Death were making a ripple in the scene, but it wasn't until that obituary came out that there was like, wow, there's actually something going on here in Florida, and it, from there it was kind of like, we packed up my van not long after that, and it was me, Phil from Malevolent, Paul and Sean from Cynic, a couple other guys, and we all went up and drove up to Tampa, and it was Morbid Angel and Death at the Sunset Club, and we were hanging out with Chuck and talking with Trey and stuff like that. So that was a cool show that we went to that kind of integrated the scenes a little bit, of different people, and us seeing the Tampa scene, and then we could see there was stuff going on in Tampa. Morbid Angel had an album already recorded. It wasn't out yet, but it was recorded. Um, so you could just feel that was like really when the Florida thing was hitting. There was also like a warehouse party in Tampa, same thing, where we drove up and we met a lot of the characters from Tampa, Mike Browning from Nocturnus. Um, I happened to meet Scott Burns, who was the producer at Morrisound. And I was like, they're like, oh, he's like, oh, this is Scott Burns. Yeah, okay. Hang on, wait right here. So I went and I grabbed Paul and Sean and I grabbed Phil and I was like, come here, you got to meet Scott Burns.
Yeah.
So I kind of
A
introduced
legend.
everybody. Yeah, I introduced everybody to Scott Burns. And that's kind of how not that they wouldn't have met anyway, but that is how it happened. And it was at this warehouse party with like Amon was before Deicide. They played, Nocturnus played, Obituary played, Morbid Angel was supposed to play, but the cops ended up shutting the party down, so Morbid Angel didn't get to play. um but that was another one of those shows where like people had flown in from like New Jersey and other places to like see this show, so like Florida was really like taking off right then.
Nice.
Meanwhile, we were back in Fort Lauderdale with Malevolent, and we were going to do our second demo at Morrisound. I had gone with this. There was a band called Elysium, and they were recording in Morrisound, and I went there with them, and I got to meet Tom Morris, and I saw Scott again, and I think Amon were doing their demo in the B room, so I hung out with them a little bit. But it was just my first introduction to Morrisound. And then from there, I would kind of stop by Morrisound every so often. Obituary would be in there. Gorguts, I remember when Gorguts was there, we would stop in and, just hang out, kind of like at the end of, you know, not interrupt their session necessarily, but kind of at, 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night, and catch the last couple of hours of their session, when they were kind of winding down. And get caught up, and we would be talking about what's going on in the scene or whatever's happening. um but I was going to do the second demo with Malevolent Creation, the 1990 demo, but we were booked, and me and Phil had come up to, we ended up seeing, I forget who exactly it was. I know Atheist was there because it was the Atheist
Yeah.
show, and we met Kelly from Atheist, and I did a stage dive, and broke my like messed up my hand really bad.
Holy
So we
shit.
so we ended up having to cancel that more sound session,
Yeah.
and and then it got better, and we were playing more shows, and it was rescheduled for later on. And I sent in the meantime I had sent we had played the Treehouse. We brought Obituary down to Fort Lauderdale for their first show out of town. That was at the Treehouse, and that was like a huge show. Like that, like I said, the Florida scene was really booming, and like you could just tell stuff was happening, and like kind of it was growing into like a worldwide thing. More popular. Like I hate to say it, but trendy. You know what I mean? It was like everybody was getting into Florida death metal. Those bands were putting out albums. Morbid Angel, Death, Leprosy had come out. Slowly We Rot was out, and Sepultura. Everybody loved that. That was huge. Um, and now bands were getting signed. Deicide was getting signed. Atheist had a new album coming. Like there was stuff going on. Um, so from there, we brought Morbid Angel down, and I'd sent the videos from Obituary, just because the crowd was so sick, and you could see that something was happening in the video just from the crowd, response. So I had sent the video up to Monty Connor at Roadrunner, and trying to get a deal more or less. And at the time, we were talking with those guys a little bit, and well, actually, that was a little bit later, but we were talking with them a little bit. Um, so problems with me and Phil Fasciana from Malevolent kind of came to a head. Um, Long story, but I ended up back at my parents' house on the West Coast, out of the band, kind of bummed, disappointed, because I had put a lot into Malevolent. I was trying to, make it happen. But for whatever reason, there was a little problem. We didn't get along. And so I ended up back on the West Coast, like I said. And from there, I ended up hooking up with Roger Patterson from Atheist,
Yeah.
the bass player that passed away. Um, Basically, again, we would load up my van, and I had my friends from over there, and we would drive up to Sarasota and go hang out with Roger. And he told me that they were looking for a drummer because Steve was going to go to college. I told his story countless times, so forgive me if you've heard it.
Yeah, it's
Um,
news to me.
yeah, so I would go up there, and we would kind of hang out and party. They didn't have a rehearsal room, so we didn't have anywhere to jam. But the plan was, he gave me a cassette tape a piece of time. He's like, learn the album and this and that. So I started working on the album, learning the songs. At the same time, I was doing like my one man solo band called Submission, and I had like a 4-track recorder where I was writing songs and recording them
Wow.
by myself with intentions to do a solo album or whatever. Anyway, so I met Kelly from Atheist, and we were hanging with Roger and stuff, and like pretty much every weekend or every other weekend, I'd go up there and hang out with him. With the plans eventually, I was going to be the drummer, and I ended up introducing Kelly to Paul from Cynic, and I kind of introduced Atheist and Cynic together,
Yeah.
because they didn't know each other. And Cynic was playing in St. Pete, so I told Kelly, I was like, dude, you got to see these guys. They're kind of into in the same vein as what you guys are trying to do, and same thing that you guys are doing. So I introduced those guys. I went up there, and it wasn't long after that that Kelly had talked to Steve, and Steve Flynn from the drummer for Atheist, and Steve wasn't going to go to college after all. He was going to stick around Sarasota longer, and they kind of got serious, and so I wasn't going to be an atheist, that was so okay, fine, nope, cool, no problem, no big deal. It was fun for me to just like learn the songs that I did learn, and cool for me to hang out, and I'll find another band, and that's how it'll go. Um, so going up to Tampa, I ended up meeting this guy. He had driven down from Maryland to go to a Morbid Angel show. It was like Morbid Angel, Obituary. I don't know who else. Nocturnus, maybe. Anyways, this place called the Masquerade, and I remember,
Yeah.
going to the show and everything's, a packed show, but at the end of the night, everybody's kind of stumbled out to the street as they let after the show was over, and I ran into this guy Ted and just started talking to him, and he was from a band called Ex Mortis, and they were putting out demos around kind of the same time we were, and they were a band up in Maryland. So he said they needed a drummer, and so I was like, all right, cool. So we exchanged numbers, and I talked to him, a couple times when I got home, like that later that week and stuff. And around the same time, just as a side tidbit, I was going to drive Atheist down in my red and white van to play a show with Cynic down at the Treehouse. And because I wanted to go to the show, and I figured I'd help those guys out. I didn't have anything going on. So that was the plan. Well, the morning of that show, Kelly calls me at like 6:30 in the morning. He's like, dude, Steve's sick and he can't make the show. Man, is there any way you can play the show? And remember, I didn't. I learned some of the, I learned like half the songs, but I didn't learn them all. And so I ended up packing my drums up, and we ended up driving down there, and I ended up playing one show with Atheist, and half of it was good and half of it was horrible.
Oh, wow.
But that was my Atheist show, and then, but that was kind of the end of that. They had Steve back, and they ended up doing their thing, and time went on. But so back to the Ted thing. I was talking with Ted about coming up to join Ex Mortis, or at least audition for him or play with him, and I I got a plane ticket to Washington to fly up there and hang out and see what was going on. I wasn't really crazy about moving to Washington just because Florida was more of the scene, but at that point I was, I wanted to do something, and I was willing to do whatever. So I flew up to Washington. Ted picked me up at the airport. He told me, he's like, hey man, I got in a fight with Ex Mortis and they kicked me out. The drummer Antar threw a drumstick at me, and that's Antar from Diabolic now. But anyway, so Ted was out of Ex Mortis. He's like, well, I got this singer, and I want to try to put something together with him. And I was like, all right, cool. Um, so we drove from Washington, flew into Washington. We drove up to Maryland to Ted's house, and then from there we drove up to Baltimore, and that's we picked up George Corpse Grinder, and
Yeah.
that's where I met George. And then the three of us, drove up to Philly, and we hung out at this. Her name was Frantic Annie, Ann Bauman, and she was kind of like a manager for several bands, and she worked at a record store, and she was kind of shaken in the Philadelphia scene and knew all the bands and people up there. So we ended up staying at her house for that weekend. And ironically, when I left Malevolent Creation, Mark Van Erp joined Malevolent Creation. So he was in Malevolent Creation, and they happened to be playing Jersey that same weekend that I was up there with George. So we all went to the Malevolent Creation show, and that's where I met Immolation guys. I think, yeah, I met John from Incantation.
My buddy.
Met all the, it was kind of like a convergence of scenes, Florida meets New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, kind of like some of that's those bands or whatever. And so that was over, and I flew back home, and when I got back home, Mark Van Erp called me. He's like, yeah, me and Phil didn't get along on the tour, and I'm not, I came back today, and all their stuff was out of the band room and stuff. And he had a house that he had rented, where they practiced. And he said he came home and all their equipment was gone. And so, he presumes that was it. I said, well, let's get something new together. I got a singer and I got a guitar player, George and Ted. And, you'll be the bass player, and we'll find a second guitar player. So I ended up packing my red and white van up again, and I drove back to Lauderdale with my drums, and me and Mark Van Erp started writing Monstrosity songs. And we ended up like that submission demo, the one man band thing that I did. I ended up plucking a bunch of riffs from that, and we started creating Monstrosity songs.
Yeah, for the
And
Horror Infinity demo.
the first song we wrote was Definitive Inquisition. The second one was Burden of Evil. And we had this guy from Miami on guitar that we kind of knew that he wasn't going to be permanent, but he was willing to jam with us. And so we kind of used him, like we were writing the songs, but we were using him to play them just so we could jam with somebody. And so we started with him. And then not long after that, John Rubin, who had been in Malevolent Creation, he got kicked out of Malevolent. So we called him and said, "Hey, come on down. Let's jam. You can join up with us." So it was me, Mark Van Erp, John Rubin, with the plan that we would get George Corpse Grinder and this guy Ted to round out the band. Well, in the meantime, I talked to this guy Ross from West Palm, and he had a club that he was doing, and he was booking shows there. And he said, "Hey, man, you guys want to open for Massacre on November, I think it was November 10th, and this was like late September, early October." And I was like, well, yeah, we were just so excited to do something that it was almost like, yeah, even before we had the band together. So from there, I called George up and I was like, hey, man, we got this show with Massacre, you come down, want to do it, and he said, yeah. And so I called Ted and said, hey, man, we got this show in Massacre. You want to do it? And he said, no, he didn't want to do it. He wanted to run the band his way, and he wanted to write all the songs, and he kind of wanted us to scrap what we were doing and do his songs. And he wanted to be the leader of the band, so to speak. But George, we ended up buying him a bus ticket, and he came down, and he started working with us, and within a month we played that show, and that was kind of the beginning of Monstrosity. And we did the Horror Infinity demo in December of 1990. Well, the band formed in August of 1990. George came down in October of 90, and then by December of 90 we recorded the demo. And then
Wow.
from there, we just started sending that demo everywhere. We were talking to Monty from Roadrunner. We were talking to Borovoy Cregan from Blabbermouth pretty much daily, with the plan that we wanted to get signed to Roadrunner. The problem was they had signed so many bands. They had signed Suffocation. They had signed Gorguts. They had signed, obviously Deicide, Malevolent Creation. They had all the, like basically 10 death metal bands, so they kind of felt they had maxed out the death metal thing at that point,
Yeah. Too much
So they,
death metal.
yeah, so they said, hey man, we got these guys from Germany, Nuclear Blast.
Yeah.
They're interested in you, and they might, they at the time Nuclear Blast didn't have American distribution, and they weren't the Nuclear Blast that you know of today. They weren't a big label like that. They had a few releases. Dismember was kind of the big thing at the time, and they sent us copies of the CDs, and we were just, we at the time we were just happy that they actually could print CDs. We were like so, hungry to do something that and we felt, it might be better to be, instead of a small fish in the big pond, to be the bigger fish in the smaller pond with Nuclear Blast. We could demand a little more, and that's kind of what happened. So from there, we ended up signing to Nuclear Blast. And by June of 1991, we started recording the first album, Imperial Doom.
Yeah. And what was like the thought process going into making Imperial? You'll Doom like what? Tell me like where I think it was recorded at More Sound.
Yeah. Like I said, I had been going to Morristown as just, a friend. I had been to so many, I was there for Cause of Death. Like I'd come down and hung out with Trevor and those guys like a couple times during that recording. I had the Deicide, Gore Guts, like I said. There was other bands too. Suffolk. Well, no, that was when we were recording. Legion, when they recorded Legion, I was there for that one. But basically, it just was the logical place to go. Originally, we wanted to go to a guy named Harris Johns who did the Pestilence album, and he had done some Creator, I think, or done some, I don't know, maybe Corner. He was a European guy, and our original plan was to use him, but it just seemed far fetched to fly all the way to Europe and spend all that money. And to be honest, we really didn't even know how to get in touch with him, and I forget what happened, but it just became from working with Nuclear Blast. We just decided that we'll go to Morristown, and at the time Scott Burns was so booked up, so we ended up using Jim Morris. We were the first death metal band Jim Morris ever recorded. Jim Morris had done Crimson Glory, which is more power metal. He had done Savatage, I think, and other stuff like that, him and Tom. But we were the first actual death metal band that he had done. And it was new and different, because everybody else was using Scott Burns. Um, so, at the time, we were kind of young and naive. It was kind of, they were the songs that we had written. We had the 4 songs from Horror Infinity, plus we wrote 5 more to finish it out. And then basically 9 songs, just long enough to get it, an album together. We just wanted an album out, and we were just so hungry for that.
Yeah.
And so June of '91, we went up to Morristown. We did the drums and the bass, and I think July we did the guitars. And did we mix it then? I think we mixed it then, but we did the first mix, and it actually sounded good. But the tom, like, remember the drum set I told you about that I bought? It
Yeah.
just, they were cheap drums, and they were like the lower level tom, and the toms just did not cut through. You couldn't hear them. So it'd be, bop, 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 bop. There would be no tom. Just the toms would disappear. And just being young and not really understanding things, I just couldn't understand. Well, why can't you just turn up the drum? Like, why can't you just turn them up to where you can hear them?
Yeah.
So, and Mark Van Erp wasn't happy that he didn't feel the bass was loud enough, and he had gone home during the mix, so he really wasn't there to say anything when we were actually doing it. But anyway, we ended up deciding that we wanted to do a remix of the album, and we talked Nuclear Blast into it. And so the date was set for, like, I want to say August or September of '91. And we showed up at Morristown, and I had this list of everything that I wanted. Like, I had gone, like, meticulously gone through every song. And, like, okay, at minute 19, the toms are buried, turn up the toms. At minute 20, there's a vocal that's kind of low. At 2 minutes and 15, turn up the solo. I had, like, all these little things that I wanted. I was just trying to be perfectionist. I just wanted, these were anything I could think of, I was writing down. And so when I showed up at Morristown with my laundry list of items that I wanted to fix, I think Jim was a little overwhelmed. He apparently, Nuclear Blast told him he was just going to turn up the snare, and that was all that was going to happen. So we kind of got into this argument. Plus, we were like blast beat crazy. The snare's not loud enough. Oh, we want to hear that pop, 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 pop. We wanted that loud and super loud. And so I think Jim kind of decided, you know what, you guys, you want to mix the album? Go ahead and mix the album. You do it your way. And it sounded great in the room and more sound on the speakers. But when you got them out on a regular stereo, it just didn't sound good. And, like, the guitars are totally buried. And unfortunately, that's the final mix of the album, the album that everybody loves and all the fans want to, rave about. It's our best album ever. To me, is the worst album, just because the guitars are so buried and the drums are way too loud. The songs are good, the performances could be better because there's just timing issues here and there all over the place, and little just issues, just because we're young and naive. We're 21 years old, the first time we're in a real studio.
Yeah.
As you know as time went on, we just, none of us were ever happy with that album, and it was kind of a case, we'll get it next time.
Yeah.
And it came out that way. Nuclear Blast released it, and it is what it is. And that's the one that for whatever reason, all the fans love it.
Yeah, yeah, and pretty much like there's always that thing is like I feel like it's like you can only it's like a learning experience, like you can evolve with like every album.
Right. um so from there, we did a European tour with Pestilence, did a bunch of shows, and we kept going. We moved the band from Fort Lauderdale to Tampa right at that time too, because we were coming to Tampa all the time for the studio, and it just, Tampa was more happening. There was more sound studios, there was bands that they're playing all the time, and just more action going on than Fort Lauderdale. The only other band was Cynic, really, and there just wasn't a lot going on. So we decided to move the band to Tampa. um, John Rubin didn't want to move. He was happy living with his parents down there in Fort Lauderdale. And he said he was going to move. And then when it came down to it, he's like, no, I'm going to stay down here and whatever. So that was kind of a bummer for us. He did play a couple more shows with us just to, finish out or whatever while we looked for a new guitar player. And at the time, we had used, another long side story is James Murphy had auditioned for us around the Horde, like right before the
Wow.
album. And that it was he had gotten kicked out of Obituary, and it kind of was like one of those things where Roadrunner was going to, they would have signed us with James Murphy. It would have been kind of like kill two birds with one stone thing. But he ended up joining Cancer and had obligations with them, and we just moved on. Kind of, it never really fizzled, or it never really happened. Kind of fizzled out. But James had introduced us to a guy named Mark English, um, and Mark did the European tour with Pestilence with us, and he was the second guitarist with John Rubin. And so he did that. So when John Rubin didn't come to Fort Lauderdale, we kind of continued on with Mark for a little while. And then we had an issue, and he ended up being out of the band. And we kind of, from there, we kind of went through a bunch of no-name guys that didn't really stay long enough to mention necessarily. A guy named Chuck, I'll go ahead and mention him, but a guy named Chuck and a guy named Adam. They played with like a couple shows, one or two shows. But one long after that, we had gotten a tape in the mail from a guy named Jason Morgan from Tennessee. And it was the guitar, like he was auditioning on guitar. And I don't know how he heard about the audition, but somehow we got the word out. And he sent us a cassette of Imperial Doom songs, pretty much note for note. We didn't, and you can't even hear the guitar riffs. So like we were pretty impressed that he was able to make it all out. It sounded like he was playing the stuff right, and he was good. So we, arranged for him to come down, and he was just, a phenomenal player. He was one of those guys that, he just sit at home and practice for 8 hours a day. And like when he showed up, he just was on a different level. And it was like, finally, we can get, move ahead with a killer guitar player and somebody who's serious, and wanted to do it. So he came down, and we started writing some of those Millennium songs.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
were playing shows. We'd gone up to Chicago, played up there, gone up to New York, played up there, and we we ended up doing the Slaves and Masters demo. And it had been 4 years, 3 to 4 years, depending on where you fall in the timeline, since Imperial Doom. But we had come into
About four.
we had come into problems with Nuclear Blast over royalties. Uh, Long and short of it was we had spent basically 14 grand on the album, and we spent about
Damn.
14 grand on the tour. So we owed the label 28 grand. And they told us out of their own words, we had sold 40,000 copies of Imperial Doom. And, you know, our publishing, we didn't have a publishing deal. And they were trying to apply the publishing to, basically, I don't know if you know how record labels work, but basically you got to pay all that stuff back out of your royalties, like the album budget, the touring budget, all that stuff gets paid back, like basically you make $1 an album, call it, and then so for every album you sell, that's just, it's roughly $1, and that dollar goes to pay back the 28 grand that we spent on the album. And then anything above that is supposedly royalties and cash in our pocket, right? Well, publishing is one of those things where you can't really you can't apply it necessarily towards the recording budget,
Yeah.
unless you sign a contract for that, And we didn't have a contract. Long story longer, basically, we had an argument over the publishing and the royalties and all that stuff. So we were looking to, we're like, well, we'll go to Century Media, we'll go to wherever, we'll go Earache, we'll go to whoever, we'll get another deal.
Yeah.
So we did that demo as a way to shop for a new deal. And in the meantime, it had been so long, we just went ahead and released the demo in the end. But we were same thing where we mailed it out to all kinds of magazines, radio, record labels, all the stuff.
Yeah.
And by that time, Borvoy Cregan, the guy who runs Blabbermouth, he was working at Century Media, and I was trying to talk to him about doing, a record deal. This was 95-ish, and he's like, to be honest, man, it doesn't matter. Your band can be phenomenal and the best band in the world, but death metal's just not selling right now, and we're just not looking to sign death metal, and more or less shut us down, So that was kind of discouraging. And I think there was a little, well, they're Nuclear Blast band. We don't want to touch them, we don't want to get involved, and kind of thing going on too. So we had a struggle finding a new label.
Yeah.
Well, at some point it was like, what, all this stuff, at least in America, I can do it myself. I mean, we can pay to get the album done. That way we don't have to pay anybody back. It's, obviously we want to pay myself back, but, it's not like we're in debt to a record company and this and that. So I ended up forming Conquest Music with the plan to, release the album myself. In the meantime, we did end up talking to Nuclear Blast, and we kind of worked things out. They came back to us with a little some royalties, and we worked stuff out. So then it worked out to where I would release Millennium in America, and Nuclear Blast would release Millennium in Europe.
Yeah.
The problem with that, there was two problems. The first problem was that I didn't have distribution in America, and I didn't realize how hard it would be to get distribution. So that was one of the issues. I ended up signing Vader for the Deep Profundus album. So it was the Millennium album and the Deep Profundus album, and another band called Dark Side. I released those 3 albums at the same time.
Oh wow.
And we just didn't have good distribution. So we were pretty much kind of doing it, through it wasn't even a website. Well, I guess it was a website. It was one of the early incarnations of websites, because back then it was still new.
Yeah.
And we would, sell to the various record stores, mom and pop type places, you know what I mean? But as far as getting in the chain stores and stuff, we had a hard time with that. And then as far as Europe goes, Nuclear Blast, even though they put the album out, they kind of sat on the album and didn't really do such a great job of promoting it. They were more focused with Emperor, or what, I don't even know what bands they had, whatever bands they were, the black metal bands of the time that they were promoting, Samael, or I don't know, they were on social media. I don't know, whatever bands they were promoting at the time, that's kind of who they were more focused on. And we kind of got lost in the shuffle by that time. And so Millennium at first, didn't really do good. It didn't sell a lot. And it wasn't until the Cannibal DVD years later
Yeah.
where they had kind of talked about Millennium, and that's when it kind of the tide shifted. It became more of a cult album, and people love the album and now talk about how great it is. But at first, people didn't get it. It was like too technical, and there's a lot of odd time signatures going on the album, so it kind of went over people's heads. And you could, like, we did a Broken Hope Vader tour. I brought Vader over, and we did that tour. When we played the Millennium stuff, you could just see that it was like, it didn't really translate well live because of the odd times. People couldn't just bang their head to it. It was like,
Yeah.
uh, you know,
Yeah. That'd be kind of weird.
yeah. And that was kind of our fault. We kind of went too extreme with the technicality, but we had that Jason Morgan playing with us, and so I was able to do whatever I could think of in my head, and I was able, so I just wanted to explore, getting as kind of whacked out as we could, and doing those odd times and doing these crazy parts. Still keeping it brutal, of course, but it was a little more on the technical side. So that's why within Dark Purity, it's kind of a mix. It's kind of has a little bit of that, but it's definitely more rooted in the brutal kind of straight 4/4 type stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of that's been our kind of our secret sauce, our formula is to kind of have the brutal and the technical and kind of blend them, and with the perfect blend, where it's not too crazy to where you can't follow it and you can't, jam along with it, but that it's not, that it's got still has something though for the musician and the guy that actually listens to music more than, your average listener, basically.
Yeah, and tell me about making in Dark Purity because I know you had a lineup change, like George had left to join Cannibal
Okay,
Corpse, and then
so just to continue the story, then, so we Millennium and Millennium came out, and it was right kind of when we were recording Millennium is when Cannibal called George, and George called me. He's like, hey man, Cannibal called me. They want, asked me if I wanted to join, and I told them yeah. So I was like, all right, that's kind of a bummer. I was like, um, but we ended up finding Jason Avery from Eulogy. They were a Tampa band that was, they had kind of run into some problems on their own. They were like a band that was up and coming, that were really like, you thought that they were going to get signed and become a big band because they were killer. They were a really good band, but just internal problems and whatever happened, they could never really get out of the gate. And by that time, they were having internal problems. And so when I came to Jason, I said, "Hey man, we need a singer," and he was like, "Sure, I'm ready to go. Give me." So from then we brought Jason in, and I wanted to finish the album with George, just because we had spent so much time on it, and we wanted to give Jason time to make sure it was going to work out before we brought in a new character to the lineup. And so that's kind of what we did. We gave him, so Jason did all the touring of Millennium, and because when he first joined the band, he didn't do any high screams like George did. That was kind of one of our signature things. Is you have the low screams, but then you also have those low to highs, poor infinity screams, uh, Imperial Doom, the opening screams like that. With a high pitched thing that George does. Um, well, Jason never did that. He was just a low grunter type death metal singer, and
yeah,
so like that was new to him, and he kind of, it took him like a year or two to kind of get into the groove of doing the high screams. And by the time he left the band, he was, he could do them for, he could just sit on a scream and do it for like 30 seconds, and just
holy
hold up.
shit,
Yeah, he got really good at it, really good.
yeah,
um but anyway, so Jason Avery did all the touring for Millennium. And by that time, Jason Morgan, he didn't wasn't working out. He didn't like Tampa. He really didn't. He just I don't know. I think he expected things to be a lot bigger, as far as like more, like more going on success wise, I
Yeah.
guess. So he wanted to go back home to, he's from skirts of Chattanooga, Tennessee. So he wanted to go back home. And so we ended up getting a guy named Jay Fernandez from Brutality. He ended up coming in, and me, Jay Fernandez, and Jason Avery wrote the In Dark Purity album. I had a couple, I had songs of my own, and then we collaborated on a bunch of songs, most of the songs.
Yeah.
And then we had, right before we were supposed to go into the studio, we had a tour presented to us for Europe. And so we ended up doing that basically. And,
And how was
it was
that?
time to start practicing for, it was time to start practicing for the tour, and Jay Fernandez wasn't showing up. And it was right around that time that Derek Roddy had introduced me to Tony Norman, and Tony Norman started showing, he showed up for an audition, and I had another guy, Jamie, that we were working with as a second guitar player. He was a young guy at the time. And basically just had to make the decision, to bring in, Tony, because he was just there and he was ready to go and he's a good player. And so it was kind of all changing at the same time. So I talked to Jason Morgan and I said, hey, man, first off, the tour went good. Uh, Tony Norman did it with the Jamie kid. Jamie Osborne is his name. Um, and we had a good tour. It was like, I forget, I think that was with Vader. Um, but from there, when we got back to record In Dark Purity, we I called Jason Morgan and I said, hey, man, will you just do the album to help us out? And then that way we can, I don't, I just don't want to get in the studio and find out that there's problems. I know you can do it. So he learned the In Dark Purity songs, and me and him recorded In Dark Purity. And then Tony Norman did some of the lead work. And because Tony Norman was going to be in the band and Jason Morgan wasn't going to be in the band, we did the band photos with Tony Norman and no second guitar player. And just again, trying to not confuse the record buying public, with all these different characters and who's in the band and who's not. I mean, we're trying to minimize that. Um, but anyway, so and then at the same time, around for Millennium, to back up a little bit, Mark Van Erp had gotten some trouble with the law, so he had to leave the band, and that's when we brought in Kelly Conlon from Death. And so we kind of had all new lineup, even by Millennium.
Yeah.
And then by Dark Purity was kind of again a new lineup. Jason Avery in the band now. Tony Norman, Kelly Conlon was still there from the second album, but things with him were starting to not work out. So it wasn't long after that album, Kelly was out of the band. We brought in Mike Pagioni, and the third album we ended up doing a deal with Olympic Records, and they had distribution through Polygram. So we were able to get into the Best Buys, and we like the same people that were working the Shania Twain album were working our album, So we ended up doing really
Wow.
good with In Dark Purity, especially in America. Things in Europe kind of like got a little weird. Um, like I said, Nuclear Blast kind of dropped the ball on Millennium. They didn't really push it, and at the time, this new label called Metal Age came along, and they were offering us a deal, and I really wasn't interested at first, but they offered us a lot of money to do it, and they had Sony distribution and this and that. So we were like, okay, we'll give it a shot, and we ended up having problems with them because they had we didn't really know enough about their backstory, and they had a previous label called Turbo Records, and they were accused of promoting like Nazi bands, like these skinhead bands, and we didn't
Jeez.
know anything about all that. And so the problem was like magazines like Rock Hard Magazine, which was like the biggest German magazine at the time. They wouldn't review our album or do anything with us because we were connected with that label. There was another magazine, same thing, where like we were just getting kind of like lumped in with this, stuff that we really didn't have anything to do with, but because we were connected with these guys, there were other things that they did that were kind of breach of contract. So we ended up um, getting out of that deal, and we ended up signing with Guido from Hammerheart Records, and he did a really good job. He ended up re-releasing in Dark Purity, and
Yeah.
he did a really good job. He made vinyl, like a double gatefold vinyl. He did these digipacks and did some really nice work, and promoted it, and it was really up and coming. And so In Dark Purity was kind of, we had, for the touring for In Dark Purity, we got the Dimmu Borgir tour with Dimmu Borgir and Samael. It was Dimmu Borgir's first tour of America.
That's
They
a
were
hell
kind
of a
of
first
up and
tour.
coming. Yeah. And so we did like 30 shows with them all around the US,
Yeah. And
and met Nick Barker and met Jagrath, all those guys. They were super
yeah.
cool, and it was a fun tour. And um, it was just, things were popping around that period for sure. We had a good distribution, we had a good tour, um, and things were happening.
Yeah, and what was that like working or having like the first tour with Jason on vocals? Because usually when bands like change singers, there's always like that thing of like, will it work or won't it work? Because I remember like for example with when Iron Maiden, they when Paul Di'Anno left the band and they got Bruce Dickinson, a lot of fans were kind of skeptical because those first two Maiden albums were kind of punky but still have that heavy metal style. But when Number of the Beast came out, that pretty much had that solidified that Maiden sound, and a lot of fans loved that.
Um, well, that was, keep in mind, we had toured with Jason ever since Millennium. So by the time we got to the Dimmu Borgir tour, he was firing on all cylinders. He was doing good, and we had tightened up as a band. We were practicing a lot. We used to practice a lot. 5 6 days a week. We would, we'd play 30 songs in a practice. Just um, not all the time, but a lot of times. We were just putting in a lot of time practicing. So, like I said, by the time Dimmu Borgir tour rolled around, we were already well-oiled machine, and things were cooking.
Yeah.
Um, so there really wasn't, because like I said, it was kind of more of a gradual change, because we didn't just rush, put Jason on Millennium and then go tour with him. It was more of like George, people, still, not that they thought George was in the band because obviously he's with Cannibal, but it was just more of a slower change, that where, and to be honest, they just weren't far off from being, some people can't even tell the difference. I can, and most people can, but there's people out there that, and we tried to keep it purposely like the same style, with the high screams and kind of, what we started as is kind of what we, continued. Like even today, there's still the high screams, and the lows with the highs, and the low to high, going starting low and in high, that kind of thing. And it's just we've always kind of had that formula.
Yeah. And then the next album is Rise to Power, and hard to believe that this year does mark 20 years of that album. So, how do you feel about Rise to Power now 20 years later?
Um, to me, it's the weakest of the bunch. Um, it was a good album. It's a good album. I'm not unhappy with it, but um, so with that was me and Tony doing the music, and Tony was really good at me and him could jam, like, write really easily together. We would do, I call it doing rounds, basically, where we're like, it's 4/4 or whatever, and every four we come up with a new riff, and we just keep going. So we'll play like a half an hour, and it'll be like, just riff after riff after riff, and new parts, So we'll start the riff, and by the fourth time of the riff, he's got it figured out enough to where, okay, yeah, this is the riff. And then he'll change the riff, and then we'd start on the next riff. So I got these tapes to where, like, where it'd be like, 5 minutes of just riff tapes. And so we could come up with these songs real, uh, it was really easy to write with him. And he was real good like that at working with me. There's some guys that, they just, it just doesn't work. It's like they can't do that or whatever. Um, so Tony Norman was really good for that, as far as writing like that. And we were able to come up with the songs relatively quick. And Sam Molina, that's where he kind of came into the picture. Um, so after the demo tour, we did some other tours, but by that time, Jason Avery had kind of discovered doing tattoos, and he kind of fell into the tattoo world, and he was making money, really good money doing the tattoos. So he was kind of falling out with the music as much, he wasn't as into it and dedicated, and basically quit the band, and Tony Norman knew this guy named Bobby, this singer. Bobby did one tour with us. He had the George voice, the kind of the high screams, and he could do all that. Um, anyway, we did a month-long tour, headline tour, and we had 2 weeks off. We had a Morbid Angel show in Fort Lauderdale, and then we had another 40 shows 2 weeks after that. So we did the first tour with Bobby, and then in the 2 weeks in between, we didn't hear from Bobby. We're trying to call him, and we couldn't get in touch with him. We had this Morbid Angel show, and so like 3 days before the show, I just got desperate. I called George. I said, "Hey man, can you fill in for this show on Morbid Angel?" And so, and that was around 2000. So we did 2001, maybe, I don't know, 2000, something like that. Anyway, we did that Morbid Angel show with George, one time reunion thing, and that was huge. That was killer. Um, so on that first tour with Bobby, we had played with this band. We had played Fort Myers on the first day of the tour, and we played Fort Myers on the last day of the tour. And both shows, this band opened up for us, and Sam Molina was in that band. And so, but I was looking at their singer. They had a pretty decent singer, and I had 2 weeks before the next tour started to find a singer. So I called that guy from that band. His name was Chase. And I said, "Hey man, we need a singer. You want to, we got a tour in 3 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever it was. You want to come up and, give it a shot." So he did. He came up, and we we played like Angel's Venom and maybe one or two other songs, but he had a lot of work to go. So like a day or two later, it was like it's getting down to the wire where, we need to be practicing a lot. And he called me up. He said, "Hey man, my wife's in the hospital and she's sick, and I'm not going to be able to make it. I'm not going to be able to do the tour, but my guitar player Sam, he does backup vocals, and he wants to audition and give it a shot. Are you guys down with that?" And at that point, I was like, "Sure, you can come up if you want to come up and jam. We'll jam with him. We'll try him out." So Sam came up, and he did good. He, like, same thing. He only knew like three or four of the songs at most, but we got through him, and he was, he did a good job with him. He had long hair and could thrash out, and he looked like a front man, and he sounded like one. So we were like, yeah. So he more or less crammed and rushed, and we had a 3-day drive to San Francisco to start the tour. And like the whole way out on the van ride there, like he's like writing the lyrics out, like, "I will not chew gum in school. I will not chew gum in school. I will not." Like he's literally writing like that, like whatever the lyrics were, he's writing them over and over, just trying to get them in his head. So like for 3 days, he just sat there writing the lyrics out while we drove out to San Francisco. And he was the front man for a while. And by that time, things were happening, and like we were getting all these offers, to do, we did this really killer Mexican tour. We were doing, uh, we did a bunch of European tours with like Dying Fetus, and we did this like festival tour, like 10-day festival tour of Poland with like, we had our own stage with us every night that followed, like the whole stage thing broke down and traveled with us every show, like it was a big operation. Like we were playing these big shows and stuff, and the crowd responses were killer and everything was good. And um it was getting to the point, like, so long story longer, me and Sam kind of worked on the lyrics for Rise to Power, and because he was going to be the singer. And then kind of right before going in the studio, Avery came around again, and he was like, he could see that we were doing all this killer stuff, and he's like, kind of, I don't know, for whatever reason, he wanted to get back in the band. And I was, kind of torn because, I could just tell, Sam was more of a guitar player than a singer, and I think he really wasn't happy being the singer, and I could see it. And so I said to Sam, I said, "Hey man, what do you think about moving you to second guitar, and we'll bring in Jason Avery, and then that way, as far as like the guy holding the vinyl album or the records or whatever, there's no member, the singer's still the same singer from the last album, we don't do it, and it just keeps the continuity still going." So we agreed to do that. So Sam went to second guitar. We brought Jason Avery back. We played like uh, Puerto Rico, sick show down there. We played Venezuela, not the same thing, another sick show. And then we did the biggest show of our career in Bogota, Colombia, in front of 80,000 people.
Wow.
And that one was kind of bittersweet because that was around the time that Morbid Angel stole Tony Norman from us. And, it was like, dude, you got 2 weeks before the tour, just come play this show. 80,000 people, come play the show with us. And Tony, he's like, oh, I got to hang out in the warehouse with Trey and learn these songs. And I was like, dude, you already know the songs. You'd already been jamming with him. But for whatever reason, he just refused to go to play that show. And, I couldn't force him, obviously. So we ended up playing the show as a 4-piece with just Sam on guitar. So a lot of the lead spots were missing and some of the harmonies were missing. It's kind of bittersweet that we play our biggest show and, we're kind of like limping on 3 wheels.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was kind of bittersweet. And then after that, we had a tour. We brought Mark English back into the band. Um, and we did a European tour, and that turned into a total catastrophe. Long story with that. I ended up losing $4,000 on plane tickets, and it
Jeez.
turned into a press debacle. And it more or less kind of soured it just didn't seem like Avery quit the band again, and it just, things went south, and it just, so I kind of broke up the band for a while. I never said that, I never put anything out, but it just didn't seem like anything was happening, and things kind of went, dissolved, so to speak. Um, I don't know, for maybe a year. And then at some point, a guy named Brian Werner, who ended up becoming the Vital Remains singer later on, but at the time, he was just a fan, and I was jamming with Mark English on another project actually, but Brian had come over and he's like, "Hey man, can you guys play Angel's Venom and let me sing it?" And I was like, "Sure, man, whatever, we'll jam." So we did that, and it was like, "Oh man, it sounds pretty good," wow. Um, and then like literally the next day, I got an offer from the Polish booking agency, Massive Music, and they had 33 shows in 33 days tour. It was literally 33 shows with no days off. They offered us, and
Holy shit.
I was like, wow, So, and the Brian did okay, So we went ahead and we booked the tour, and we planned to do the tour. So we did that tour with Brian, and then there were some things that we just it just didn't work out with Brian in the end. And on that tour, the opening band was Vile, and they had Mike Robachek singing for him, and that's where we met Mike Robachek. I'd actually met him before, but that's where I really met him and hung out with him. And so when it came time to do Spiritual Apocalypse, we were calling Mike Robachek, hey man, you want to be the guy? Because he just had a powerful voice, really strong, and he seemed like the guy. And he came down and he did a good job, and he was with the band. Obviously he did the 2 albums, Passage. He did Passage of Existence with us and stuff. But the reality was he just really wasn't into touring like we wanted. And uh, for example, like after Spiritual Apocalypse, we toured for the album. We did the tours that we did do. And I'd say around 2010, my plan was, okay, we'll take the band off the road, record the new album, and then time the new tour with the album. That was kind of my goal. And so that's what we did. We took the band off the road. It just took forever to get the Passage of Existence going. That's a whole nother long story.
Yeah.
But fast forward to 2018, we had the album done. Metal Blade's going to put it out September 7th. The Polish booking agency offered us a tour for September 15th. And Mike had he was going to be best man in a wedding, so he couldn't make the tour. It's like one weekend was going to salvage a whole month worth of shows. And that was kind of disappointing, but I was like, okay, all right, no problem, whatever. Things happen, and I understand you want to do this thing with the wedding and whatever. So a couple of days go by, and the Polish booking agency comes back and say, okay, well, that didn't work. How about an October tour with Vader, opening for Vader, on 30, another 30 shows or something. I was like, all right, cool. So I took it to the guys, and Mike again, he's like, I'm supposed to go to the Keys with my wife, and I'm not, on one weekend, and I'm not going to be able to make the tour. He just didn't want to tour, and it kind of um, so basically the momentum of Passage of Existence, we weren't able to tour for the album. We finally got to Europe in May, which was 6 months later, and by that time the album had kind of dissolved, like the excitement of having the fresh album had dissolved. And the tour was okay, wasn't the worst and whatever, but it kind of just disappointed me huge, because I just we'd taken the band off the road. I wanted to have try to do the 1-2 punch of having the new album, new tour, bang, boom, have it hit, because it's always, ever since we started, it's always the album comes out, and then 6 months, 7 months, a year, whatever goes by, and then we finally get to Europe.
Yeah.
And then we do the new, so because like for the Millennium album, we didn't get to Europe until 98. The album that came out in 96, we're already recording the next album when we're in Europe for the last album. So it's just, we wanted to time it right. So, and, I don't blame Mike Robachek for that. He had his things going, and I understand, but it was just for me personally, it was just a disappointment because, I wanted to, I want to do this. That's what I play music. That's what I want to do. So eventually it came to the thing to a head where, he just didn't want to tour, and he wasn't, he said he'd, record with us still if we wanted him to do that. But, and even with COVID, I was like, hey man, COVID's hitting, you sure you want to quit the band? It's not like we're going to be playing all the time. It's going to be COVID. He's just like, nah, he just wasn't into it. I don't know the exact reasons. I still don't know, but he just wasn't into touring and doing this, like we wanted to do. And so we auditioned one other guy, but in the meantime, Terry Butler from Obituary, he recommended Ed, and I know Ed. I've known him for years. I was like, oh, why didn't I think of that? He'd be killer. So we brought Ed into the thing, and that's who we've been working with for the last year and a half or whatever it's been.
Yeah.
And he's doing great. Everybody, all the fans love him. He did great in Maryland. He did
Yeah.
great on the European tour. He's doing good. So we got Mark Venner back in the band now, playing bass. So he's in another original member back in the band. So there's two original members. I got Matt Barnes from Alabama. He's been in the band for like 13 years now. He's kind of taken over the spot of the main guitar player. This guy we used on the 2019 tour, a guy named Justin Walker. He's kind of a younger. He was literally born the year the band formed.
Oh, wow.
So it's funny in that. Yeah, but he's killer, phenomenal player, and so it's good to have him. I'm working with him, and he's busy. He plays in some other bands and stuff, so so there's some scheduling conflicts sometimes. So we've been bringing Sam, we've been using Sam Molina. So when Justin's not available, and it's not up in the air, at this point, I can kind of people know that the quality levels pretty high. Whoever I bring in with, it's going to be good. And it's at this point, as long as I'm there, I think Monstrosity can exist, and people come to expect that don't write everything, but I'm writing 50% at least. I write all the lyrics, so the style, even though it's been different members, Monstrosity style has always remained intact. You read the reviews, you read that, people understand, people get it, So the new album, keep going. We did the drums a year ago in San Francisco Audio Hammer, where we did Passage, and I finished the drums up a year ago. We spent from June to December doing the guitar tracks, and Matt Barnes, me and him working back and forth over the internet, and we got those in December. We got offered a tour for Europe, and I was kind of like, well, that's going to slow the album down, but we need to keep things going. So doing that European tour, same thing. We ended up offered a South American tour in March. We ended up doing the South American tour in March. So it slowed the album down a little bit. So now the news of the day would be that starting next week, we're going back over to Sanford, Florida, and we're going to start bass tracks next week, the 15th weekend of the 15th. We're going to do bass tracks for the new album.
Yeah.
And hopefully, part of the studio scheduling, Jason Sukoff, the producer over there in Sanford, he does, a lot of these new metal bands, Carnifex.
They're my
Death
boys.
Angel's one of his big bands.
Yeah.
So he gets, he's a busy guy and he's booked up. So with trying to fit in with his schedule, it kind of slows us down a little bit. But that's the interest. It's worth it for us to wait to work with him. So, but hopefully we can get this knocked down. We're going to do the vocals. We're going to do those at Morris, with Jim Morris. I've already talked to Jim. I work with Jim on another project called Mystique. This singer named Mystique. He's kind of a power metal singer. They have Crimson Glory. That's a whole nother long story. I've got another project that I did with Midnight from Crimson Glory before he died. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Yeah, I've looked it up on Metal Archives. Yeah.
Right. So basically, I died in 2009, but I released his original CDs, 3 CD disc. I released that in 2014, and I'm announcing tomorrow that I'm releasing covers album. So I've been kind of working on that this week.
Awesome.
And for the last 2 years, I've been working on that kind of behind the scenes. getting that ready. We got photos coming out for that and CDs and stuff. And I think a lot of, it's a different kind of music, you know what I mean? But it kind of connects to that Florida metal Morris sound, you know. And Midnight was such a phenomenal singer. If you listen to the Trent album, I mean, the guy was insanely talented.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, that's what I've been working on. So I've been working with Jim Morris on the Misty project, like I said, last for the night. So we're going to do the vocals with Jim. It's just local. It's easy. Plus, it's fun to work with Jim, and it makes sense. So hopefully we can start mixing fall.
Yeah. Awesome. So before we go, I just want to thank you for this conversation. It was really great to hear your in-depth history. Is there just anything
Yeah,
else you would
I
like
mean
to
that's the
plug?
story. Kind of took your ear off, but
Hey, I like it.
that's the story.
Yeah. So everybody leave from Monstrosity. We'll see you next time.